Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the launch of our new series, Open Poetics, hosted on CUNY's Manifold app. I first want to thank the Digital Humanities Department at CUNY for working with us and supporting us through the actually quite long development of this project over the last few years. Robin Miller, Matthew Gold, and Jojo Carlin. Thank you also to Miriam Atkin, who has worked really closely with me to both conceptualize, develop, and realize this project, and also Amanda Monti, who's here today participating in the event, for bringing this edition to fruition. We are really excited to share with you a new digital critical edition of Joan Retallack's Memnoir, originally published by the Post-Apollo Press in 2004. We have Joan Retallack here today to read and discuss the work, as well as Erica Kaufman and Omar Berrada, both of whom worked on the curation of the edition with us. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the Post-Apollo page on the Litmus site, just in the interest of time, but quickly, between 2010 and 2016, Litmus absorbed into its catalog over 200 titles published by O Books, begun in 1986 by Leslie Scalapino, and the Post-Apollo Press, begun by Simone Fattal in 1982. It quickly became clear that a creative utilization of the intersecting and overlapping catalogs would be necessary, as well as dynamic archival approaches to the wealth of poetic material generated by Scalapino, Fattal, and many important writers they published. This Open Poetics series is one of such approaches, aiming to preserve the kinds of texts that might fall out of circulation or out of use in the classroom, and so out of active engagement with the poetic endeavor of the text due to issues of availability as well as accessibility. Keeping so-called minor texts or texts that might not fit current ideas of marketability activated as part of a complex and multi-dimensional representation of a life's work has been at the core of this project from the beginning. It has also been fundamentally important to us to develop resources for anyone wanting to engage with an experimental or otherwise challenging text, whether or not they have institutional access. It is particularly exciting and appropriate that we launch this series with Joan Retallack's Memnoir. Our conceptualization of the series is grounded in pedagogical approaches to teaching and reading experimental poetries and deeply informed by Retallack's own poetics, so that the establishment of this series and the first book in the series, Memnoir, are intertwined on the ground level, providing a well-articulated template for our future editions, its own poetical wager of sorts. As Erica Kaufman writes in her essay included in this edition, the title is On Joan Retallack's Memnoir, Investigating the Experience of Experiencing. Erica writes, Retallack offers angles of inquiry that emphasize complex interrelationships instead of first-person tunnel vision, which is precisely what this critical edition sets out to offer in relation to the text itself. The Open Poetics platform sheds a light on the many layers of a published work, its past iterations, the texts, artists, writers it converses with, and its context within a larger body of work, emphasizing its perpetually in-process character, its participation in a life unfolding. By focusing on accessibility rather than marketability, which to some degree must bend a work and its presentation to its own logics, we are aiming to preserve a space for inquiry and investigation, a point or points of entry to a multi-dimensional puzzle. Rather than an answer to a question such as, what does it mean? We offer here an invitation to construct new questions and to follow the inquiries and experiments those questions will demand. I'm very happy to welcome next Amanda Monti, who will give kind of an introduction to the edition and as sort of a narrative orientation as I bring up the website itself.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, everyone. So I helped to bring this edition of Memnoir to fruition in the past few months, which has been a huge joy. And before we dive into some readings of this critical editions, we are actually going to do a little walkthrough of the platform on which this edition now exists, Manifold. And Tracy's also going to drop a link to the edition into the chat. So you can feel free to click on the link and do your own explorations while I speak, or you can also sit back and relax and save the link for later to do your own tracking around the website, because truly we are going to do a little walkthrough, but the joy of it is to explore it intuitively, and that is how it is also designed. But just to give a brief introduction of what the platform is and what it can do. So this is Manifold. Manifold is a newish publication platform specifically for scholars and publishers, by scholars and publishers, which is basically a big project library. And the projects all vary in content, but they are all there to be a teaching resource. And many of the texts that are available online currently to students are nestled in clunkier websites like Project Gutenberg. And so Manifold really tries to be user-friendly and accessible for online viewing of these texts. And it is a collaboration between CUNY and the University of Minnesota. But like Tracy said, it's freely accessible to anyone inside or outside of these networks. You only have to create an account, which is pretty simple. And so Open Poetics is the collaboration between Litmus Press and Manifold. And like Tracy said, we are currently building a teaching catalog for works that are otherwise out of print or more difficult to come by. And before we dive into Memnoir, I just want to, Tracy, if you want to scroll down a little bit, I want to hint at our next projects and publications that we are working on in the coming year, which are From A to Z by Ital Adnan and Happily by Lynn Hijinian. So those are also both post-Apollo and O-book titles. And we are continuing to expand this teaching catalog with more titles. But that aside, let's dive into Memnoir for a little demonstration of this critical edition. So this is Memnoir, and the core of this edition is, of course, the text in itself, the ebook version of Memnoir. The edition we designed together with Joan Retallack and also Erica Kaufman and Omar Berrada, who, like Tracy said, are both panelists on this webinar. So Memnoir on Manifold as the ebook gives students and teachers quite a lot of possibilities to engage actively with the text. The platform allows you to do something that is called social reading. So Tracy is currently demonstrating that the platform allows you to annotate and highlight certain parts of the text. So similarly, like writing into margins of a book. But the good thing is that you can choose whether you would want to see other people's annotations. So Tracy's father is going through the places in which she has already annotated things in the text. And the platform also allows you to comment on other people's annotations. So students and teachers can start conversations around these highlighted and annotated text excerpts, and you can drop links and outside sources. So there's a lot of possibility with reading these texts as ebooks. And you can also form reading groups and again share your highlights, share your annotations if you so choose. And then let's go back to our project. And one more thing that I would really want to point out in this critical edition is, of course, the resource collection. So Manifold allows you to upload resources as part of the text, and they can take any shape. Our curation around the digital edition came with a logic of not providing a complete, exhaustive list of anything that exists in relationship to Joan Retallack's work or to Memnoir, but we rather wanted to offer some illuminative elements rather than explanations. Tracy is currently showing a selected bibliography, which you can access through the website, as well as other places where Joan Retallack's work exists, such as Pensound and Jacket 2, which is kind of also offering a glimpse at the author's larger project and framework. So, and if we want to go back to the resource collection, we have 3 other resource collections. The next one would be historical artifacts. Very exciting resource collection to me, because these are also different entrance points into the text. These are material references which appear in Memnoir or are referenced, and the platform allows you to also build this very material archive and situate the text a little bit in a material ecosystem of things. Again, this is best to be explored in your own time. And another collection is called Alia Versions in French translation. Also very exciting collection because it truly allows you to trace the evolution of Memnoir and see the text as something that is growing and process-based. You can trace the text back to its first version in Chain, to its second version as a chapbook published through Wild Honey Press. Tracy's showing all of these resources now. And there's also the French translation, of which we will actually hear some today. One of the translators, Omar Berrada, is with us. So this is our penultimate resource collection. And then our last collection that we want to show you briefly is essays and external writings. Again, kind of situating Memnoir in an ecosystem of conversations, discussions. All of these essays you can download onto your computer, so you can also access them offline. And again, some of these essays will be activated in our webinar today by the panelists. Erica Kaufman's essay is also here, which she will read from later but again, you can refer to it after our reading by engaging with the platform. And so before I hand it off, I want to just again reiterate that this is a very brief overview of the website, but I really want to invite you all to take a browse around and find your own trail and find some of the many gems that we have sprinkled across this digital edition of Memnoir. And with that, I'm really beyond thrilled to hand over my virtual microphone to our panelists and readers for this afternoon. Please welcome with me Joan Retallack, Erica Kaufman, and Omar Berrada. Thank you.
I think if I can be heard, can I be heard? I will perform the segue to reading some pages of Memnoir. But first want to say how delightful this whole process has been up to the last minute, putting this Zoom together. And just enormous thanks and gratitude for the people who have been part of this, two of whom you see, in my view, sitting on my head at the moment, and Tracy Grinnell, who has made extraordinary things happen for a long time with her publishing, first a wonderful journal, and now a tripartite publication house for exciting and often strangely delightful, what can I say, cutting edge fiction and mainly poetry. So I'm going to read several pages of Memnoir to get this started, and that will be followed by Omar and Erica, and we will in fact do a kind of conversational version of the French translation with the English, and then we'll have conversation. Memnoir. Mem, what's our relation to the past? Noir, same as to the future. Mem, then what's our relation to the future? Noir, you don't want to know. Mem, in other words, the jig is up. Noir, in other words, the jig is up. Curiosity and the claim to happiness. Studies have shown that the brain prefers unpredictable pleasures. Present tense. It's said that it happens even in nature, e.g., during the childhood, the mother might have had a taste for film noir and taken the child along. My machine is hooked up to my machin, things inaccessible to the precise methods of, e.g., a Brazilian bookmobile being hijacked in a dark underground garage. Fiction is precisely what they now call nonfiction, to get a bit too presonal. I.e. Eurydice, my dark darling, don't worry, I can bear you are not looking at me, she cried out, i.e. hoping it was true. Now, here, together in the mix of the modern metropolis, Rio, Vienna, Paris, Tokyo, Moscow, Hong Kong, Lagos, New York, Bombay, London, Mumbai, he and she both feel close to the idealized neuron in the book. Some of the diffuse sensations of early childhood may still surprise us when we consider their names, e.g., joy, frustration, shame, anxiety, love, rage, fear, anger, wonder, curiosity, disgust, surprise, longing, humor, pride, self-respect, fear, but not terror, fear, but not horror. The mother, however, might not like surprises, e.g., wanting to know for how many generations a Negro in the bloodlines can produce a throwback. The word is memory. The child recalls this use of memory, does not know what to say for a very long time. The soul is inwardness, as soon as and insofar as it is no longer outwardness. It is memoria, insofar as it does not lose itself in curiositas. Otherwise, one could ask at any moment, e.g., in what story does an uninvited goddess walk in and roll a golden ball down the hall? Or why not enjoy the story of lovers in the same vein from different centuries, but in the same story, from different worlds, but in the same story? I write down my dreams. This is probably not one of them, i.e., for a very long time, the child wanted more than she could say, to not want more than she could say, i.e., impossible, according to any simple formula of mirroring formulas. If, e.g., but for the accidental clause, the swerve of curiosity on the monkey bars, the flashbulb memory, the wall of fire outside the window, and or something as vague as living in time, i.e., for a time near what seemed to be near things swept into the stream of self-translation in the coincidental flow of events. Near disregarded syllables, suddenly audible, vol up, sudden outburst of song, sudden, it's too funny, how funny it is to feel sometimes and not others, how to remotely sense a sweet violence in the brevity, i.e., the spilt second glance. Without yards of shimmering adjectives, description, is description possible? Can a sunrise be described by yards of shimmering adjectives? While the curate was saying this, the lass in boy's clothing stood as if spellbound, looking first at one and then at another, without moving her lips or saying a word, like a rustic villager who is suddenly shown some curious thing that he has never seen before. She gave a deep sigh and broke her silence. At last, doing her best to restrain her tears, she began the story of her life in a calm, clear voice. Without the carefully constructed container, story, is story possible? Can a life, even a portion of a life, be contained in a story? Would songs be better to repair the brain? When, if it's curiosity that draws attention to curiosity, even the other animals like us, even in nature, if for only the space of time, e.g. at the watering hole, e.g. during those times when it's too wide or too narrow for ambiguity, the horror, even then, there. The range of genres might now include humor and but, or horror, even then, there. This voltage through the body is brought on by the senses. Strictly speaking, in logic, nothing is accidental. The world divides us into seekers after facts, seekers after gold, dig up much earth and find little, or less than a Port Royal stain. It's super being natural, not wishing to symbolize the wish to return to feel as much at home in, e.g., a fortunate sentence as in, i.e., an unfortunate century. Some may see at this point, which is not an Archimedean point, the necessity to invent a game in which all vowels are serially replaced with X. Etc. Or that it is not an idle game, after all, to forgive that they or we in the slit second of a single pulse, to reveal the tear, the tears in all the pages, in all their ambiguity, paging through X number of photo albums, knowing and not knowing all that is not there, with only a few clues to go by. E.g., fake cheetah fur, fake cowboy hat, small dog straining at leash, small notebook, or any other kind of book that can be open and closed at the same time. I.e., all this and more with the ontological thickness of a scratch and win sheet. Look, see the red, blue, green space at the watering hole. Hear the animals slurp. See the animals roll in the mud. Witness the archaeological trace of something less visible than a zoological park. The mother, the father, stiff in Sunday best, the insistent curiosity of the child, the timing is all that is off. It is that is the problem with the timing, that it is always off, while it cannot be off at all. Omar?
Thank you, Joan. It was beautiful to hear that text again, 20 years later for me in your voice. I will explain later, but for now, I will read an excerpt from Sian Nai's Ugly Feelings. Fear and its implications for the politicization of aesthetics. Here, bad or suspicious timing, a question that is central to conspiracy theory. Why is it that at the same time plays a prominent role as it resurfaces in a poetry that unapologetically aims for what Spivak has described as the agential grasping of the spectral entity that is patriarchy capitalism. The motif of bad timing will bring us to the question of the vexed relationship between poetry and theory, a relationship that not only played an incisive role in the historical development of late 20th century language-centered avant-garde writing, but remains of pressing concern to feminist writers in this cohort in their efforts both to theorize their own work and to assert their contemporaneity. For as Gertrude Stein noted, what it means to be contemporary is by no means self-evident or something to be taken for granted. Quote, "It is so very much more exciting and satisfactory for everybody if one can have contemporaries, if all one's contemporaries could be one's contemporaries," end quote. The problem with the timing is that it is always off while it cannot be off at all. We can see some of these questions about gender, fear, and timing converge in Memnoir, 2000, a short poem by Joan Retallack. It might, this is a quote, "It might be necessary to replace all vowels with X, magically turning premature terror into post-post irony. It is that is the problem with the timing, that it is always off while it cannot be off at all. That is the he to be sure that the she did not choose the wrong thing. The always off timing seems to reside in an oscillation between the excessively early, the PRXMXTXRX, the premature, in other words, and the excessively late. This timing clearly has affective consequences, since the transition from precipitatedness to belatedness involves a shift from terror, TXRRXR, to irony, XRXNY, while at the same time producing an illegibility undermining the transformation itself. The surplus of X's that attends the shift from one emotional tonality of late capitalism to another, premature fear to doubly belated irony, recalls, so premature fear, premature terror in the text with the X's instead of the vowels, to doubly belated irony, post-post irony with the X's, recalls an analogous moment from Diane Ward's long poem, Imaginary Movie, in which a similar excess of signification coalesces around the issue of timing.
Thank you, Omar.
So I'm going to read a couple of pages from Memnoir, and then I'll be reading the section of my essay that corresponds to those passages. And this is from around the middle of the book. Present tense. Coming out of the movie theater, the world is bright, too bright, gnomic, present tense, tensile, everything happening at once. The world is full of its own mute history, the fatality of reflection, the fatality of nature and culture, the fatality of the German sciences of culture, the fatality of, i.e., mute history remaining mute, the fatality of the preposition reaching out to its object, even as it, e.g., it slips away. The proceeding is much too or not sentimental enough to accommodate the experience of the child is fatally wounded, i.e., the house is a mess. The streets are littered with trash. The lawns are littered with trash. The grass is dying. Shrubs are pruned to look like gumdrops. Grass is mown to look like astroturf replaces the grass. Up the stairs of the stoop, onto the porch, into the house, the noise is incessant. The grass is broken. The broken glass is littered with people. I have a confession to make. I have not answered my mail, my telephone, my email, my calling, my God, my country, my conscience, my desire to. I.e., what a pleasure to dissolve into the spot on the graph where the logic of what people are supposed to know, don't want to know, don't know enough, to have any opinion on the outcome of another beer-bellied bake-off intersects with the logic of what people are not supposed to know before or after the crime scene has been cleared, washed down, scoured, repaired, reconstructed, renovated, restored, rejuvenated, retrofitted, revenged, resettled, unrecalled. Also, no, not also, there is memory, as in trying to get to the fire, the way to the big light, the photon points the way to itself. And this is the last section, or the last page in Memnoir, present tense. See that shadow on the wall? That's you. Childhood initiates the child into senses, hungers, proclivities, expectations, exhaustions, anxieties, terrors, horrors, humors, the experience of experiencing all that's pointed out, and then the noisy, silent rushes, telescoping in and out, i.e., stops and starts, ruptures and surprises, surprise, surprise. Guess what's inside? This time, the instructions read, pull out your prize, fold and tear your prize here. Carefully, tear out the red and blue striped part of your prize. Place it between your thumb and index finger, gently pinch together to force the prize to bend. Let it go, flick it into a cup. Flick it to make decisions. Who can flick it farther, you or your friend? Take it outside, flick it, and watch your prize as it flies out of your hand into the air. And this is the last section from my essay, which takes its title from that last page in Memnoir, on Joan Retallack's Memnoir, Investigating the Experience of Experiencing. The essay is in 9 parts, and each part begins with a quote from a different piece by Gertrude Stein. So this one begins with a quote. And how do you do, and sorry, I'm gonna start over. And how do you like what you are? Memnoir concludes with the line, quote, watch your prize as it flies out of your hand into the air. Appropriately, by ending on this image of watching, there is no conclusion. The poem ends looking outwards at that which is unpredictable, but pleasantly so. It's also important to note that the book really concludes with a list of sources, including multi-genre authors like Ovid and Hans Blumenberg, further cementing that this text is truly a conversation or dialogue between texts, individuals, histories, and time. Quote, the proceeding is much too or not sentimental enough to accommodate the experience of the child is fatally wounded, i.e., the house is a mess, the streets are littered with trash, the The lawns are littered with trash. The grass is dying. Shrubs are pruned to look like gumdrops. Grass is mown to look like astroturf, replaces the grass up the stairs. In this excerpt, Retallack paints a portrait of a landscape or scenario, but the portrait is not site-specific nor experience-specific. It seems as though a specific place is being constructed, but this is a space that can be read as universal, just as the questioning of too much or not sentimental enough takes into account that each reader will experience sentimentality differently. Additionally, the word accommodate indicates that the experience to be explored is not predetermined, but rather always in flux, therefore requiring the proceeding to be flexible or accommodating enough. The end of this particular excerpt reads, quote, "I have a confession to make. I have not answered my mail, my telephone, my email, my calling, my God, my country, my conscience, my desire to." By moving from a landscape in the process of disarray to "I have a confession to make," the piece shifts into a possible critique of the reliance on things that preoccupies most experiences today. Rather than simply acting and interacting, we're all bogged down by the sheer number of responsibilities we feel to the various devices that allow us to be monitored or trapped into a specific routine of commodification. Retallack writes, quote, "A noticing, questioning, inventing of constructive ways of being a non-destructive part of our world is essential, to my mind, to combat conservative smugness and the destructiveness that comes out of a greed for my security, my nostalgia, my preferred stability." In presenting a litany of what is not answered, Retallack seems to present a way of achieving this mode of being a non-destructive part of our world. Does the solution to destructiveness lie in not answering? Toward the conclusion of the poem, Retallack writes, quote, "Just finish the damn story and be done with it. Stop according to some acceptable convention of stopping." In this shift from not answering to stopping, the expectation for written forms to have some semblance of closure is questioned. On the one hand, we experience the familiar desire for something to be over, the just get it over with kind of phenomenon. But on the other hand, the stop depends on some acceptable convention for stopping. Poetically speaking, nothing ever really stops, but rather the past, present, and future are all in a continuous dialogue with each other. So this moment in the text serves as a commentary on the problem of thinking a stop is possible, but we know it's not in the continuous present of Memnoir. Memnoir concludes with, quote, "Watch your prize as it flies out of your hand into the air." The image of a prize drifting off into the sky is one that's familiar, like a red balloon full of helium drifting into the clouds. But here it is the experience of experiencing all that's pointed out that precedes this panorama. Our geometries of attention have been redesigned, and we just watch the prize drift off as if it's part of our unnoticed actual condition of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was wonderful. We are moving into the duet part of the afternoon. Joan and I will read together in French and English conversationally. Just a short bit from the text in French and in English, just to make you hear the French and the interplay, the sonorous interplay of the French and the English, which is also the way it was translated and I'll explain the process of translation after we read. But it was translated with Joan in the room reading the English. And in the spirit of experimentation, we have decided to take a cue from Quranic recitation for this duet. As some of you may know, the Quran is divided into chapters, which we call surah, and each chapter is divided into verses, which we call ayah. And these verses are numbered, and those numbers are markers in the text. They're units of meaning, they're units of sound, and they provide a kind of rhythm for the reciter. Because the Quran is, you can read it to yourself, but it's also meant to be read out loud in a kind of recitation or chanting that has rules, and we will not attempt to follow those rules, of course. But there's one, let's say, occasional feature of Quranic recitation that we got interested in for this, which is that now and then the reciter will read a verse or chant a verse and then make a short pause and then reread the end of that same verse into the beginning of the following one. And that and with sometimes the different intonation, but that kind of creates a rhythm to the reading and to the text. So, Memnoir. Mem. Quelle est notre relation au passé?
Noir. La même qu'au futur.
Mem. Alors, quelle est notre relation au futur?
Mieux vaut ne pas savoir.
Même, autrement dit, c'est râpé?
Autrement dit, c'est râpé.
What's our relation to the past?
Same as to the future.
Then what's our relation to the future?
You don't want to know.
In other words, the jig is up?
In other words, the jig is up. The music swells, i.e.
La musique enfle, CAD.
i.e. the music is swollen with the sweetness of virtual pain.
CAD, la musique est enflée par la douceur de la souffrance virtuelle.
Pain, ritual pain.
Virtuelle, souffrance rituelle.
The ritual can hardly contain the virtual pain.
Le rituel contient mal la souffrance virtuelle.
Virtual pain, one thing is for sure, one thing is for certain.
La souffrance virtuelle, une chose est sûre, une chose est certaine.
For certain, one AKA is standing in for another.
Et certaine, un alias est mis pour un autre.
For another, while the culprit just sped over the horizon.
Pour un autre, alors que le coupable vient de fuir par-delà l'horizon.
Spewing technicolor exhaust.
En vomissant des gaz technicolores.
We now know nothing that is not tonic.
Nous ne connaissons rien aujourd'hui qui ne soit tonique.
Not tonic or dominant or chronic or acute or diachronic or diacritical or synchronic or diametric.
Qui ne soit tonique ou dominant ou chronique ou aigu ou diachronique ou diacritique ou synchronique ou diamétral.
Or diametric or all or neither, except in all the implications of all the cultural references.
Ou diamétral ou tout ou rien, sinon dans toutes les implications de toutes les références culturelles.
E.g., in the movie version, there may be sexually suggestive parents.
Par ex, dans la version filmée, il pourrait y avoir des parents sexuellement suggestifs.
An alcoholic uncle.
Un oncle alcoolique.
A child trapped in a well.
Un enfant piégé dans un puits.
In a well laboratory-induced schizophrenia in cute animals.
Dans un puits, schizophrénie générée en laboratoire chez d'adorables petites bêtes.
Incessant gun violence,
Incessante violence des armes à feu.
burning crosses,
Croix en flammes.
unusual sexual preferences,
Préférences sexuelles inhabituelles.
adult language,
Langage adulte.
vomiting,
Vomissement.
along with many respectable binaries, good, evil, male, female, nature, culture, inert, rapture, capture.
Avec nombreuses dichotomies respectables. Bien, mal, masculin, féminin, nature, culture, inerte, captivé, capturé.
Just finish the damn story and be done with it.
Arrête donc cette maudite histoire, qu'on en finisse avec elle.
Done with it. Stop according to some acceptable convention of stopping.
En finisse avec elle, termine suivant des conventions de fin acceptables.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joan and Omar. That was beautiful. And Erica as well. Erica and Amanda will join us again. So we do have a little time for conversation and discussion. I wanted to let the participants know we can take questions if you want to put them in the chat. And there's also the Q&A feature of the webinar if you want to use that, and we can all draw from those questions. I thought I'd just to begin the conversation, invite Omar and Joan, since we just heard the translation, to talk about that process, and as Omar alluded to, which I think the translation was 2002, is that right? So yeah, okay. So speaking of continuous present.
The translation took place in 2002. It was published in 2004, just like the English edition of Post Apollo Press, but just before the English edition of Post Apollo Press, I think. This is an instance where Borges might have been happy the translation came first. And
I'm certainly happy.
there you go. And actually, it's interesting you should say that the continuous present and which came first, because this reminds me that, so this happened at the invitation of Un Bureau sur l'Atlantique, a desk on the Atlantic, which was an organization that was founded by Emmanuel Ocard and Juliette Valéry in France in the late 80s, in 1989, and that did a lot in terms of translating US poetry into French and publishing it and all of that. And one of the ways that happened is group translation seminars, collective translation. The first time I participated in one of those was maybe 2001 or something like that. And actually, Etel Adnan and Simone Fatal were in the group of collective translators then, speaking of Litmus and Post Apollo Press. And so I was invited again in 2002 for the seminar around Joan's work that was to happen in Marseille at this International Poetry Center in Marseille. The thing is, I lived in Paris and Joan was to fly into Paris. And I was asked by Juliette to meet Joan at the airport in Paris and then take the train with her to Marseille, the high-speed train, so that everything would go smoothly, because I was used to the train and all of that, and maybe Joan was not. And as a kind of, hosting, being good hosts for the wonderful Joan Retallack coming to France. And so I was 22 or 23 at the time. I didn't have a lot of experience with all of this. And so I go to the airport and I had a big yellow folder on which I had written Retallack in big letters. And I get there and I wait and I don't see Joan, and I thought I was late and that maybe she had gone out and didn't see me and that I had gotten into trouble. And I gathered my energies and went to a phone booth because there were I didn't have a cell phone, and called Juliette, who was already in Marseille, to say, I can't find Joan Retallack. What do I do? And so Juliette calls Joan at home in the US and finds her and says, Joan, but what?
She called and I answered, and she said, Joan, why are you not in France? Awful.
And what had happened is that, of course, it was not the same day in France and in the US. That when you fly from the US to France, you fly on one day and you arrive on the next day. And so there had been a mix-up in the dates, which is very appropriate to this work, obviously. We were still in the past when I thought we were in the present, vice versa. And so I went back to the airport the next day and found Joan, and we took the train.
And it was lovely. We had nonstop conversation.
This does not yet tell us much about the translation itself. Do you want me, Joan, to say?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Something
So,
about the way
the Emmanuel and Juliette had a model for this, and they had experimented with it a number of times and published a number of translations that way. And the idea, and it's also was done at the Abbaye de Royaumont outside Paris with other languages than English. The idea of it is that you gather 5 or 6 people in a room with a poet who comes with a text, maybe 30 pages or so of text that is meant to be translated in the space of a week or 5 days or something like that. And the idea is that not all the people around the table or in the room are translators, and not all the people in the room know the language that the author or that the text is written in. The idea is that translation is writing, and that the people around the table are writers, poets in their own right, and that one of them is bilingual. One of them knows writes, in this case, writes in French, but knows English very well. And that person is, and the idea is that, so there's that fact, and there's the fact of the presence of the author. Especially for poetry, it seemed important. So what happens is that Joan arrives with her text, and she is in the room while she is being translated. And she is asked to read her text out loud so that everybody in the room, whether they understand English or not, hear it. They hear it, they hear the rhythms, they see how it sounds, And so the person who is the bilingual person, and that was me in that case, so we do it page by page or paragraph by paragraph or something. And so Joan would read a section and I would kind of perform orally a spontaneous word by word translation of it. So it wouldn't be a great translation, but it would be a kind of, it would come from that moment, from hearing it, from reading it. And so with that word by word translation, so I would be what they called the word by worder, which in French works better because it's the mot à moteur, which is the word by word engine in a way, right? So it would be an engine for the group. That word by word translation gives everybody in the room something to work with in the so-called target language. And so everybody kind of writes it down, and everybody then starts thinking. Everybody has questions. We have questions for Joan. We have questions for the word by worder. The first day is always a little bit awkward because not everybody knows each other. There's like a dynamic. It takes a little while for the dynamic to take place. But then, and I've participated in many of these, magically, towards the end of the first day or sometime in the second day, a new character enters the room, and that is the collective translator. There's a certain moment at which a kind of energy of translation gets ignited, and it moves faster, and there's a kind of call and response thing going on, and then everybody's more at ease with everybody, and then Joan also understands what is going on, and then doesn't mean it's easy or easier. It just means that there is an energy of exchange and experimentation going on, and I remember endless discussions about the most arcane details and the most simple things too in the text. You know, how do you translate in text like this, e.g. and i.e. and all of those things? Because you would think that in a Roman or Latin language like French, the IE and the EG would be no problem, but they're not used in the same way, either orally or in writing. So you'd have to kind of negotiate and find something. And so I should stop here. I will just say that there is what happens, and I'm sure Joan will have more to say, but there is what happens in the room during those 5 days. In this case, I don't think we managed to translate everything in the room in the 5 or 6 days. But then what always happens is that somebody is tasked with editing the collective translation, rereading and editing it, and in this case also completing it. And 3 of us did that. It was Juliette, Valérie, Emmanuel Ocard, and myself. So that we met again later in some other place, and we worked on the text to finish it for publication. And I should just say at least the names of the other translators who were with us in the room. And they were Rémi Ourcade, Sarah Kerina, David Lespiot, and Pascal Poyer. And that was in 2000.
Others who dropped in, notably Jacques Roubaud, on the last day of the translation. Yeah, well, I don't have anything to add on that. That's a beautiful description of what we did, and was enormously exciting to me at the time, not just because it was my work, but because I've been very interested in approaches to translation that are not, you know, just basically looking up each word in the book, stringing them together, trying to get the grammar right, and not that anyone actually does it that way, but it's this was really sort of diametrically distanced from so much translation that I think never gets to the juiciness of the language in the way this did. So it's, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just curious. I was thinking of, as Omar was talking, the mot à mot, the motor, the word for word motor, and thinking also, of course, we have Stein is ever present here in automatic writing, and just thinking about that really nice intersection between that moment and translating that feels like it elicits that idea of automatic writing. But I guess I'm curious, Joan, at that in the process of translation, you're in your reading, and this and Omar is sort of immediately doing a off the cuff kind of translation, and I'd just be curious to hear you talk about that, and maybe given that they were, well, the French was published just before the English. I mean, was there, the text was in a sense not finished, right? Not published in that and encased in the binding yet. So I'm wondering if how that experience of the translation that's so active and enlivening in that moment right before, if that sort of had, or what impact it had on the final, so-called final text. that was published by Post Apollo.
Yeah. Well, I loved hearing Omar's sort of, well, what can I say? So instant translations that were that felt really good. I mean, just at the outset, and and then the sort of the cross conversation about all of the things that would break out, you know, in the next moment. So it was very exciting. And I really, I mean, I credit Omar just enormously with that actually appearing in the way it did, and I'm very happy with it. There are things about the translation that are really interesting because there are not symmetrical situations or meanings of certain things, and one of them actually comes up immediately in the Memnoir dialogue. So, and that actually, I think it would be interesting if just to give that as an example. So it was certainly, you know, listening to tones and rhythms when I was reading, but it was more than that because it also had to be finding something that that would work in the sort of ecosystem of French that just didn't exist in English. The second question, I actually did not. I think the Post Apollo already had my manuscript when I, you know, brought it to Marseille.
Yeah.
So there was not a chance for me to, thank goodness, because I could take another couple of years enjoying doing things that came out of my experience with that translation. As you well know, I mean, that could have delayed it for a very long time with of course the whole world waiting with bated breath for it. But at any rate, if you don't mind, Omar, would you just say something about those last lines? The
jig is up.
Yes.
I don't know how much I have to say because I try to remember, you know, what the debate must have been, and I really can't remember how it came about. I just remember it was hard to come up with something because for many reasons. I mean, you know, there is like jig is a specific word that, and then there is all the colloquial nature of the expression, and then there is the one syllable nature of the English language, all of these one syllable words, so that create a kind of specific kind of sound that's very, very difficult to reproduce in French, which tends to have longer words. So I'm trying to kind of figure out how we came up with sérapé. I
mean, I do explain that it brings on a reference to cheese.
True. True. Sérapé literally means it's grated. And it's a way of saying that, you know, that something is kaput. Yeah, something didn't work out. It's too late. It's done. It's over. It's kaput. And it's kind of, it's short. It has a rhythm to it. It felt. I mean, I don't know. There may have been a better ways to do it, but this is what we came up with, I guess.
It is a fact that, of course, RAPE in English has a very charged meaning and connection, and that I don't know whether that figures, well, it might figure into what a bilingual reader who is reading the French first might associate with it. But Tracy, if there are any questions from in the chat box.
I don't see them, but I guess I would love to ask Erica if let's see, I think you need to be unmuted, Erica. But I'm just to come back to, and to bring, I guess, to bring Stein into it a little bit, and maybe to just talk about the you know, how your essay, you had started with this essay working with Memnoir, but also that you mentioned the section titles from Stein's work, and maybe that I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit. And in relation to, I mean, it's, I think, you know, I guess to bring it also around to the way that we're hoping or proposing that this text be used, or this edition be used in teaching, in a teaching context.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really exciting to listen to this conversation around translation, because, you know, my essay, as you know, I adore Memnoir. I've taught Memnoir several times. And as I was working on this essay, I kept finding myself stuck, like I wasn't sure, you know, it was almost as if each time I sat down to work on the text, it was a new text. So the essay itself is actually written procedurally to a certain extent. So what I did was I took, I was moving back and forth between the Stein Selections text from the University of California Press that Joan edited and wrote an extraordinary introduction to. So I was moving back and forth between passages from Memnoir and quotations from Stein that I was generating somewhat randomly. I knew I wanted to work with nines, and I knew that I wanted to do a lot of close reading because I was fascinated by how the text was working. And that, you know, that's a little bit about my process as far as how this essay came to be written. You know, as I was listening to Joan reading, and then Joan and Omar, I was also thinking about the way in which one of the great things that a digital critical edition does is it invites students to become part of a broader conversation around a text, particularly a text that they might not have access to otherwise. And Tracy, I'm continuing to think about what you were saying when we began about how, you know, this is a platform that makes works available for folks who might not have specific institutional access, which I think is also something that's really, really important about, you know, what this series is doing. And, you know, it just feels so beautiful that Memnoir is the first book in the series, because it, to me, at least as a reader, it's a text that, you know, reaches out and grabs an audience. So I guess I want to pause there.
Yeah. I mean, I also, as I was preparing today and throughout this, I just have, you know, I want to thank you, Joan, I think, and everybody here, but you know, I think this initially began, again, in a conversation and, you know, asking if I knew that Memnoir was out of print or nearly out of print, and whether, you know, whether you would want to reprint it. And you said, well, what about something like a some sort of digital critical edition, which sort of like, well, that sounds great. I have no idea how to do that. So let's figure that out. But I think, I think for, the reasons you're saying, Erica, that it kind of contains all of these, what I feel like are all these priorities of works that are accessible inside and outside of an institution, that these it's a short work, so it's something that can be read in its entirety and really engaged with in its larger context, yeah, so I think that establishing this series with that, with this articulation of how we think about, as teachers, all of us as well, think about reading and teaching these works, that yeah, I think that was a complete thought, but
I would also just love to say a 10-second thing, which is that for those watching, there is a wonderful prize. There are these things that are possible online that are just so, I don't know, I'm very excited about it. So I'm not going to tell you what the prize is, just that you might find it in historical artifacts.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think I didn't finish my sentence, but I think the end of my sentence and my thought, which that intersects with Joan, is just that being able to work through these questions of what this edition might consist of and what it might look like has been so crucial. And your as I was saying in the introduction, that your broader poetics are so so fundamental to thinking about what this series might look like. So I just, and it's fun, and it's humor. There's humor and gravitas, of course, but it's just, I think too, that element of, even in constructing it, to start going on these, following these threads of, I found a Judith Butler article on Eurydice that I hadn't seen, that, that I threw in for the discussion today. And so I just think that it opens that relationship to a text again is so really wonderful. So yeah, thank you for being game.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. I mean, it's been fun. There has indeed been lots of humor and, just the right amount of gravitas.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, to create a formal stopping point, perhaps, we will, just want to thank everybody for joining. We will make the recording available. I also want to thank Molly Hirsch, who's doing the webinar, pulling the webinar strings behind the scenes, and also Debbie Thompson, who's been doing the live captioning. So thank you for that tech support on the back end. And thank you all. Thanks again.